Welcome, everybody, to the opening keynote of CHIWORK' 2022. Welcome to our online participants, and also welcome to the in-person participants. I'm thrilled to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Dr. Neha Kumar. Neha is an associate professor at Georgia Tech with a joint appointment in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs and the School of Interactive Computing, and her work lies at the intersection of human-centered computing and global development. Neha was trained as a computer scientist, designer, and ethnographer at UC Berkeley and at Stanford University, and she thrives in spaces where she can wear these three hats all at once. Her research engages feminist perspectives and assets-based approaches towards designing technologies for and with underserved communities. And Dr. Kumar serves as the ACM SIGCHI President. And just on a personal note, Neha is certainly someone that every time I talk to Neha, I learn something. So I'm very much looking forward to her keynote today. So thank you, Neha, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
No pressure. Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me okay? And you see the slides okay?
Yes, all is good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, for helping take forward this idea that Andrew and Orit have shaped and nurtured over the past 2 years publicly and for possibly much longer before then. And also to everyone who's been involved in putting together this fabulous hybrid effort. This is care work. I'm also grateful to the many conversations that we've had the privilege of listening to, participating in, learning from in this past year, where I served as one of the TPCs, and I bring these to this talk today. And finally, those who are new here, just becoming a part of this community, for being willing to take this chance on us, thank you. This talk is about care and the work that it takes. And as you listen to this talk, I hope that you'll find your minds making connections with the research topics, the people, the methods, the worlds that you care about that have taught you about care. So these are the people who have taught me most of what I know today about care, students and former students who have journeyed through the Tandem Lab at Georgia Tech, which I advise. I'll be drawing today in this conversations that we've had one-on-one, in lab meetings, in group chats, and with the papers that we've written about research, about people, about life. And I'm also excited to share that this is something of a collaborative talk today. So after I'm done going through the slides, Marisol, Navina, Azra, and Vishal will join me in the Q&A. So feel free to ask about any of the research that I'll be talking about today directly to the speakers. Okay. So a quick word about my positionality, right? Who I am and how that plays into my role as an HCI worker. I grew up in India in a middle-income household, mainly in Delhi, where I'm located right now. I left the country when I was 16, when I moved to Germany, which brought me to experience for the first time what it meant to look different and to talk different from those around me. So if you didn't, okay, great. So if you didn't see the photos, and I just want to see now, so Marisol, Navina, Azra, and Vishal are joining us today. And I'll be talking a little bit about all of their work. Okay, so next slide, I was talking about my positionality. So I mentioned that I grew up in India, I moved to Germany. And what I mentioned about talking different, this was a feeling that continued as I started college at UC Berkeley, where I studied computer science and math, and in classrooms where there were barely any women. And also core to my experience in undergrad was my volunteer work for an education nonprofit when I first dove into understanding historically marginalized Indian contexts in support of more and better opportunities for education. My background, my experiences, what I learned at Stanford, Berkeley, and as a software design engineer in the Microsoft PowerPoint team helped me bring together training, passion, skill, and calling to what I'm doing today, which in large part is focused towards studying ecologies of care, where access to care isn't easy, struggles around power abound, and enabling care is at its core about restoring dignity. Given my own roots, I'm deeply committed to worlds that are globally diverse, inclusive, and equitable, to a world within HCI that recognizes and honors knowledge that comes from different corners of the world, from and about individuals and communities from differently diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and with the acknowledgement that this can all get a bit misguided and saviorist if I'm not constantly careful. This awareness in large part comes from my reading of scholars such as Chandra Mohanty, who helped me recognize how I'm simultaneously situated in the Western world and the so-called third world. And this bit from her resonates with me in particular. I am clearly located within the one-third world. Then again, I straddle both categories. I am of the two-thirds world in the one-third world. I'm clearly a part of the social minority now with all its privileges. However, my political choices, struggles, and vision for change place me alongside the two-thirds world. Thus, I'm for the two-thirds world, which is basically the global south, but with the privileges of the one-third world. I speak as a person situated in the one-third world, but from the space and vision of and in solidarity with communities in struggle in the two-thirds world. And the reason that she's using these terms instead of using the terms global south and global north is basically to highlight that these geographic binaries are a bit unhelpful when we're really thinking about structures and inequities that impact people around the world. So these boundaries, I will add, are not set in stone. They change and we change. But to me, the message here is that we need to always be an acknowledgement of this fact that we constantly, all of us, occupy positions of less and more privilege. And this places on us the necessary burden of always having to adapt and to situate ourselves. This also takes care. So let's talk about care. Fisher and Toronto define care in these terms: a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. And in my years of working with and understanding care, it has come to mean bringing and restoring dignity and the work that goes into this. My initial plan for this talk was to focus just on care work in the context of frontline health, which is what Ezra and I have been studying over the past decade. But then care isn't just about caring for the body, it's embedded in deeper systems that enable it or not. This took me to the work that we've done with Navina and with Marisol about using care as an orientation, a lens to uncover possibilities and limitations for tech and design. Except that care isn't just about the what and the who, but it's also about the how. The rigor with which we pursue our work and make it good, whatever good might mean in context. And increasingly, as we expand our purview within HCI and CSCW communities to the wider world, we've got to do better at the how. And yet, all of this falls short if we don't bring to it a deeper philosophical commitment. This is praxis. What does it look like to bring care into the knowledge work that we do, into the HCI work that we do? Why do we or should we choose to do this in the first place? Care forms a big part of who we are and what we value. So packaging this into 4 neat boxes wasn't easy and likely reductive, but these 4 layers of care have helped make sense of the care conversations that are constantly running in my head. And I hope that as you're listening, they can do the same for you to some degree. So first, I'll talk about care as research. This is the most likely path for most of us to stumble upon care in HCI and CSCW research, the communities that I'm primarily in conversation with, where care serves as the object of research, whether it's in hospital or home settings, in individual or collective contexts, formal or informal institutions, and so on. And in the last 2 years, through the pandemic, we've also heard endlessly about the care crisis that we are increasingly faced with. It has centered care workers across the globe with the recognition that these workers are being more and more impacted and that our care infrastructures are gradually, steadily crumbling. Against this backdrop, I've had the honor of advising Azra's dissertation work, which takes a worker-centered perspective in the context of global health. Since 2016, her work has focused on the frontline workers and their workflows, and more recently, how they're being recruited to support the development and success of AI systems in their work. These women workers function as a first point of contact with the state healthcare system. They're almost all women, so mostly underpaid, overburdened with a wide range of care responsibilities. As innovations around technology are developed, they get drawn into the tasks of collecting data, using data of AI applications, or implementing AI recommendations. So we ask, how might AI systems in and for frontline health be designed from a worker-centered perspective? And we break this down to two further questions. How are these systems currently being designed, and how are their current designs failing frontline health workers? In this focus on women frontline workers, we align with feminist academic and social movements. So within HCI, scholars like Shao and Bartzel have called for feminist approaches to design. More recently, Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein have argued for intersectional feminist approaches to data science. And more broadly, our work aligns with post-colonial, transnational, and third world feminist movements that center the experiences of women historically marginalized in the global South. We also align with calls across disciplines that attend to the exploitation of women in care work, in the home, and in the workplace. So in this paper from CHI-21 that we cite below, we conducted an analysis of the discourse on AI and global health, drawing on data from an extensive literature review and 3 years of fieldwork to examine challenges and potential for AI efforts when viewed from the perspectives of these workers. And a simple way to frame this effort would be in terms of the streetlight effect. The streetlight effect is a widely recognized phenomenon dating back to well, there are various different traditions, but this one that I'm referring to dates back to a fable by Mullah Nasruddin, a Turkish poet and philosopher, and it alludes to a type of observational bias where one looks for things where they are easiest to find, such as keys under the streetlight, but not where they're likely to be found, maybe in the dark at home. And Mark Moritz has also written about this being a tendency with big data, where he says, without checking facts on the ground, researchers may fool themselves into thinking that their big data models accurately represent the world that they aim to study. And it is this effect that we uncover also in our paper with respect to the advancements of AI in global health. And when we started working on this project in the summer of 2019, we had repeat encounters with AI enthusiasts in and from the global South who were pushing to deploy data-driven approaches with just not sufficient regard for realities on the ground. On the one hand, we found ourselves in conversations where there was unwarranted enthusiasm about the impact that AI could have in the world of frontline health. And on the other, we were shaped by our own ethnographic findings, introducing us to the everyday struggles of health workers in highly risky and physically taxing jobs, their unaddressed demands for better pay, for better working conditions, and emerging perceptions and use of mobile technologies. The intersection of technology and frontline health was not non-existent before, but has definitely grown substantially across research and practice post-COVID. Efforts to advance AI and frontline health have multiplied. And okay, I'm able to find my cursor, sorry. But yeah, going back to, so the goal of this project was basically to compare two different methods. So the first one was looking at an analysis of 347 literature sources in CS and AI and HCI. Also engineering, medicine, public health, industry, and government. And the second set of data that we used was ethnographic data from stakeholders across clinics, households, chat groups, social media. And what we try to compare across the two was basically to see where the AI efforts were focused, and also what was really going on in the field, what were the workers' perspectives, right? From this long paper, what I'll summarize here is basically what it says about the frontline workers and their workflows that were generally not very well understood in the literature that we reviewed, and for a variety of reasons. And a major aspect of health workers' work was planning and coordinating home visits. AI systems have been recommended to address the ad hoc nature of work in such settings and to help with planning, but we need to take into account the extensive high quality data collection that these systems require and where the burden falls, right? We also need to consider how these workers are already planning their workflows, such as by focusing on the most underserved settings and revisiting homes if no one's at home. So we need to treat these workers' time as fixed given their already high workload. And these workers serve as key connectors to local communities. So several organizations have tried to leverage their position as connectors to deliver different kinds of AI-driven services to communities, including diagnostic tools. But diagnosis is only one of many tasks that the workers are involved in. And so we need to consider how these tools integrate and support the entire workflow. These workers also end up with the responsibility of having to address multiple sociocultural dimensions of health. And when there are structural issues that impact vaccination rates and result in measles outbreaks, AI systems for diagnosis may not catch these aspects. And finally, a fundamental issue was a lack of recognition of the work and the knowledge of these workers. Any AI systems that are deployed here need to engage them in design, need to engage their perspectives, and surface their concerns as much as possible. And recent research on data for advocacy also offers promising directions where AI data-driven systems can try to align with the perspectives of workers, but this is only possible if the control and the ownership of data and the system is also at least partially in the hands of these workers. Right. So what do we learn from looking at where the focus of AI systems is and what's really going on with the workers' perspectives? Our paper lays down considerations for the design of data-driven systems that target social good more broadly, situating our analysis in the context of frontline health work and workers. And so I'll quickly summarize lessons here. So foregrounding worker or user agency, for example, expect targeted users to not use these systems at all, or to use them in unexpected ways, or to work around the systems altogether. And that's what we've been learning from prior research, which may not have been AI focused, but this is what we've seen with technology. We need to learn from those lessons here. Rethink scale, for example, focus on hyperlocal deployments, use AI to maximize use of the fixed time of health workers and care work rather than introducing new workflows that are going to be additionally burdensome, or think about including more stakeholders instead of scaling up with limited consideration of stakes. Move towards a more pluralist worldview by supporting self-determination by communities on the development and the use of AI. Develop sustainable interventions that check extraction of resources, for example, streamline and leverage existing data flows rather than introducing new ones, build systems that require less data, be directed about collecting data when required, compute less on the devices of the underserved, and build for lean computation and power consumption. And follow-up work has been looking at these data flows and how we can streamline them so that there is less of a burden on the workers. Next, embrace diverse epistemological commitments, right? So through reckoning with the source of discomfort and choosing to engage meaningfully and not just performatively when we're considering ontological and epistemological differences. And finally, develop solidarity. So focusing on common struggles, such as the global struggle of frontline health workers for better pay and for better working conditions, including from the South to the North. So we've looked so far at one set of findings, right, that are really pushing for looking at the worker-centered perspective, because if we don't, then the pressure on them is rising, which is just exacerbating the care crisis that we've been hearing more and more about. And we also need to think about the need and the opportunity to push for redirecting the massive funds that are being directed into AI solutions in this context. I'd like to do a quick shout out here to Naveena's inspirational dissertation work, which she defended this week, that engages with the politics of care in the context of the global South and pushes for going beyond the technological fix. So reading out a quote from her dissertation, this line of inquiry is also valuable simply because the politics of care is a starting point for thinking about equity and wider anti-systemic struggle. If care workers are mostly women, understanding the effects of technology in care work means understanding the effects of technology on women's working conditions. If care work is foundational to human survival, understanding the role of technology in care work shapes how human rights like healthcare, food, and water are provisioned. So she notes that in response to crises of care, societies often reorganize care, whether it's spatially, financially, or technologically. And scholars of sociology and geography say that we come up with a care fix that aims to displace the burdens associated with care work, whether to technology or to other people or other geographies, if not actually resolving capitalism's crisis tendencies by reducing focus on profit and efficiency. Right, so the conversation around tech fixes in healthcare has become more prominent with the rising uptake of smartphones and mobile internet, the development of AI and data-driven technologies for healthcare, and pressures to digitize healthcare due to the COVID pandemic. Technological fixes by themselves may not necessarily be inherently good or bad, but they can become part of design narrative that suggests how we should go about addressing the care crisis and who or what care work can be displaced to. They can also actively engender harms, as we saw in the case of Azra's work as well. So the big question here is that this work and Azra's work really are asking, can we as technologists and designers dare to imagine alternative futures for care workers, right? That center the experience of these workers in ways that are sustainable and holistic, and such that we don't settle for fixes and aspire to a world where care becomes the organizing principle of our communities. So moving on to box number 2, right? Let's take a step back now from thinking about care work that is centered around bodily well-being. Care also operates as an orientation, as a lens, and we'll look at how. So for some context, looking broadly, research in the field of sustainable development, such as in global health or in education, has frequently focused on deficit. Health workers as lacking training first and foremost, right? Girls as lacking education about their bodies, women as lacking education about technology. The dominant discourse remains the discourse around lack, around what's missing. And the paradigm of asset-based community development that is fast finding traction in HCI pushes us to shift our attention from deficits-focused thinking to identifying, engaging, and leveraging individual and community strengths. So we can view people as being socioeconomically disadvantaged or victims of patriarchy, infrastructurally challenged, discriminated by caste, class, or race, or all of the above, but we can also recognize that they have assets, right? So they are rapidly becoming owners of mobile technologies and have access to the internet, for instance, or they may have access to land and to institutions, but there may also be non-material assets that can contribute to community development, as Yosso has pointed out in her work on community cultural wealth. And so Navina and I explored the role of care as an asset, as a non-material asset, pushing for work in the space of HCI and development to explore and engage with other assets that might also be present. So our paper drew on ethnographic fieldwork and design-based research at an after-school center in an underserved neighborhood in Mumbai that lasted about 9 weeks, where we drew on more than 100 hours of observations, 58 interviews with various stakeholders, a co-design workshop with teachers, and a focus group with parents. And our research goal here was to take an assets-based approach, right? We were working with a learning environment, and we wanted to focus on what we could identify as assets in this space. And that was the focus of the exploratory ethnographic work. So we looked at existing technologies, we looked at literacies, we looked at behaviors and how they could be leveraged to support the learning environment, particularly one that involved technology-based or technology-enhanced learning, because that was what was desired by all of the stakeholders. It wasn't really our intention to go looking for care, but it was impossible to escape it. The coordinators sought to establish an ethic of care within the center in the first place. She felt strongly that the students should think of the center as their own and view her as a facilitator, not a principal. The teachers and the staff mirrored this care for students at the center, despite the fact that their stipends were low. They also worked with parents on a regular basis. Senior students would support junior students, and together they cared for the center as a third space. And these caring behaviors were then interconnected with various forms of caring for the technological engagements within the center, variously in support of the learning environment. And we engaged primarily with Nell Nodding's work, who has shown that modeling and teaching care is essential for the teacher-student relationship. We showed how care can also have ecological impacts throughout a learning environment. So essentially our finding here was that care brings attention to being able to act on values, and then technology can extend, support, leverage those motivations and actions towards the fulfillment of learning environment goals. So here it's through care that we're able to see how technology could be useful or meaningful in this context. And there was something similar that we found in this work that Marisol led. but in a completely different context, right? So there was a 7.8 intensity earthquake, which caused widespread disaster in Ecuador in April of 2016. And this is when citizens across the country self-organized to gather, mobilize, and distribute supplies to affected populations, assuming the role of ad hoc humanitarian logisticians. Drawing on 4 months of ethnographic findings, we presented a situated perspective of how these citizens straddled the boundaries of online and offline activity for earthquake relief. And in doing so, we offered an hopefully enriched understanding of how various social media channels might support informal on-the-ground crisis response, but also where they fall short in the process. So by studying the emergence of care where social media fell short, we were able to make recommendations for technology design to improve the effectiveness of logisticians in crisis response. And by examining the bodily engagement of our participants at crisis sites and their efforts to deal with material convergence and how they interacted with social media for technology-mediated care, we also contributed an understanding of the socio-materiality of care that emerged amidst efforts towards crisis relief. And we use this orientation of care to study the context because by highlighting the care-based actions that citizens are willing to undertake in relation to the disaster landscape, it helps us to unpack the reasons that motivate these actions, thereby suggesting those citizens' information needs that could be supported further. Right, so in both of these cases, we see care as orientation, which allows us to uncover possibilities for technologies that are rooted in already expressed needs and aspirations of our participants. But care isn't just about the what, where, and who questions. It is also about the how. And as we expand our purview to embrace more and more diverse populations and contexts within the field, we need to rethink how we're engaging with them, right? We're increasingly crossing cultures, we're engaging across class, caste, gender, and other divides. And we need to understand that the methods that we're using, the perspectives that we're engaging, needs to do justice to the people that we're working with, right? So here, care is rigor and the how and how good we're able to do it. So this is continuing this thread of asset-based perspectives. Marsol's dissertation project asked, how can technology support the educational system in catering to the needs of Hispanic immigrant parents? And this was a 4-year ethnography in 16 locations with more than 300 participants in Atlanta in the US. Now, part of this project and fundamental to this project is a question, instead of starting from people's needs and deficits, can we take an approach to design that starts from a deep understanding of people's assets, right? So going back to the asset-based approach that I mentioned recently. So here there's a stress on the situated nature of assets. That is, people are not static beings and their assets are not static either. So how can we view them in their changing strengths and capacities and determine which asset to leverage and for what design goals? So drawing from cultural sociology and shifting emphasis from assets to capacities, we engaged Anne Swidler's theory of culture in action as an analytical lens for unpacking the complex relationship between capacities, goals, and structural limitations. And this work that was co-authored by Drs. Betsy and Carl DeSalvo leverages findings from a participatory design engagement with 35 Latino immigrant parents in Atlanta for envisioning parent education technologies and demonstrating the applicability of this lens. And the main contribution of this work to HCI is really a discussion of how to analyze the design potential of capacities and consider the methodological particularities for collecting them. So I won't go into too much detail here, but for highlighting that when we're grappling with difference in our research context, we might need to reassess our toolbox, right? To think of different methods that allow us to cross cultural barriers while still seeing people as whole beings with agency, with power. Marisol is also here to go into more detail about this design approach, if you'd like. And also along the lines of method, I'll talk a little bit about Sachin's work here. So Sachin is a PhD student who I co-advised with Dr. Manwante Chaudhary. He couldn't join in today, but the work that I'm talking about here was just presented at CHI-22 and it's available on YouTube if you'd like to look. And it talks about going from treatment to healing towards a decolonial digital mental health. So like with other illnesses, many have argued that there's a universally large gap in treatment for mental illness. And according to the Lancet Commission on Global Mental Health and Sustainable Development, in the global north, 1 out of every 5 people get the minimum standard of treatment for depression. And in the south, it's 1 in 27. Right? Research around mental health and mental illness has become ubiquitous in the field of HCI, and increasingly people are thinking about how to offer technology-mediated support for mental health. And this could look like predictive analyses of when someone may be at risk of severe distress, or interventions to improve individual health. And together, these lines of inquiry explore how technology might be able to improve mental health and prevent symptoms of mental illness. But if we take a step back and we really look at where these methods are coming from, right? The methods to assess mental health and mental illness. Literature around the history of psychiatry documents that colonial power relations have been defining factors for what forms of distress have been validated by clinicians as being mental illness, and provided and what care looks like, and what forms of distress have been ignored. Definitions of mental health and mental illness have been used by institutions of power to exclude multiply marginalized people from care, to infringe on human rights, and to silence political dissidents. And we need to know the conceptualizations of health and illness that underlie the design of digital mental health tools to understand whose needs those conceptualizations might marginalize. Right, the veil of scientific objectivity that psychiatry provided was often used to justify oppression by state and medical actors who worked for colonial governments, and to link definitions of mental health to racist categories. And this influence survives today through racial and other identity-based biases in constructs that are used to diagnose mental illness. So diagnostic scales that are derived from those constructs, including those with identity-based biases, are often used uncritically in digital mental health initiatives. And so we need to think about basically the histories, right? And so this goes back to this idea of what care as rigor looks like. And in this case, when we're thinking about trying to address identity-based biases in the case of digital mental health, our work tries to show that we need to go back to looking at how some of these measures have been put in place. And so that commitment to history and to tracing where these assessments come from, the sources of them, is a method, is the care as rigor that I'm talking about here. So in this work, through foregrounding how coloniality has had an influence on how we understand mental distress and illness, we analyze how these current tools end up erasing and invalidating minoritized forms of distress. Right? We drew specific attention to how social, political, and economic factors have influenced the creation of mental health classifications and treatments, while also erasing indigenous ways of knowing and healing. Analyzing the presence of colonial classifications and tools in digital mental health tools, we argue that digital mental health maintains these colonial inequities. And as HCI researchers, we need to be conscious of these power dynamics when designing digital mental health tools, and to leverage the unique affordances of technology-mediated care so that we can imagine and create more equitable methods of understanding distress and providing care. So very quickly, what does it mean to go towards a decolonial digital mental health, right? So the decolonial part is really in explicitly acknowledging the role of colonialism and coloniality in creating mental health that prevents people from accessing care based on their own experience and risking harm in pursuing care on their own terms. As for the digital, we need to consider how the design of technology-mediated support might propagate historical forms of marginalization and power dynamics that rob individuals of agency over their care. And with mental health, we need to think broadly about what might bring healing to an individual rather than the treatment of specific symptoms, centering cultural validity and medical pluralism. So in sum, I really encourage you to read this paper. It's really long and really detailed. But it just goes to stress that we need to think about methods in diverse ways so that we can address diverse needs of the people that we're designing for and with. Okay, so we're now at care as praxis. And as we expand our worlds, we also need to think about expanding our worldviews. And this will entail developing a critical consciousness in the terms Paulo Freire, where we bring ourselves to question the perspectives that we've held on to and make space for more. Right? This isn't easy because it requires giving up the assumptions that we've been holding on to as learners or educators or researchers. And these are fundamental questions such as, what do we consider knowledge and whose knowledge counts? Now, Navina, Marisol, and I, and many, many others, Vishal as well, have been involved now for a couple of years in a conversation around citational justice in HCI. So whether and how our citational practices recognize voices that have historically been located on the margins of HCI knowledge production. And why braving? Because recognizing our complicity in citational injustices and our role in working towards citational justice calls for courage, and like with many other kinds of learning. But this is also a much larger conversation. It's not only limited to HCI, but really all disciplines. And this excerpt that I have here, there was a Nature article about this topic earlier this year on the rise of citational justice that Navina and I also contributed to. And it points out that articles by male authors, for example, are cited significantly more than those with women, right? So basically, if you add a woman to your list of authors, then you're going to get fewer cites. That's the research that is presented in this, one of the findings presented. And the more dimensions of underrepresentation that you add on, the lower the citations. So questions around citation go deep, right? Do we know why we cite, how we cite, and who omit to cite and why? Where does that responsibility lie? Is it with an individual? Is it with the institutions that we're a part of? And also, more fundamentally, what do we think of as good work? Because that is the work that we're going to end up citing. So papers have politics, and through citing and not citing, they shape knowledge productions. And here we join a growing coalition of voices to discuss the politics of knowledge production and epistemic injustices in HCI. For example, Tawana Dillahunt has talked about subfield bias against certain topics and methods in HCI. For instance, qualitative research tends to be less appreciated than not, although these things are changing. And Anonymous and colleagues and Sheena Arete and colleagues respectively discuss the epistemic violence perpetrated against researchers with disabilities or against Black women in the HCI community. And citations exercise agency in knowledge production, often in accordance with these biases. For example, they show us how ideas are valued or not, and they can also distort, amplify, and erase work over time. And we're not the first to want to ensure citation practices amplify marginalized voices. There are database repositories of work by groups that have been marginalized in knowledge production, for example, CiteHer by blackcomputer.org. Researchers have long been creating new social networks to learn about who does what work and amplify scholars from marginalized groups, for example, through workshops and networks like People of Color Also Know Stuff in political science. There are zines, blogs, and other scholarship which have discussed how to improve citational practices, such as Amriti and colleagues, How to Cite Like a Badass Tech Feminist Scholar of Color. And there have been efforts across academic institutions around centering work done by different marginalized groups. So viewing citations as relationships instead of a distribution of wealth, we find that citations do or do not make it into a paper based on who we look for, or who we relate to, or who our peers are expecting us to cite. And this relational framing that we offer in our paper gives us a path forward to try and enact citational justice. Iris Marion Young has argued for the notion of political responsibility, that we must recognize our duty to transform structures of injustice. And in taking responsibility and developing a critical consciousness, as Freire argues, we need to unlearn these biases and then learn how various forms of oppression shape citation practices and knowledge production more broadly. All right, and with this, we're better equipped to take collective action. So, what is this call to action? It is to use citations as anti-racist feminist technologies, for example, by using them to cite scholars of color, to use them to draw connections between isolated nodes of knowledge, honoring both commonalities and differences across works, for example, recognizing that work done in disparate geographies could productively inform each other, to break the culture of silence, which Freire says is necessary for developing critical consciousness. So with citations, this might mean normalizing talking about citational injustices and asking for recognition of scholars on margins. to push institutions and research communities to justly evaluate work and awards and promotions in light of issues like subfield bias. And we can question supposedly objective criteria used to gatekeep scholarship, admissions, and hiring. We can also consider how our reviewing practices impact citational justice and disincentivize reviewing behaviors that fail to recognize the politics of knowledge production. And this journey to strengthen our citational practices is an ongoing one, right? So we welcome feedback and dialogue as we work as the community to brave citational justice. There's also a website, citationaljustice.org, where we're maintaining a repository of work on this topic, if you'd like to check it out. Okay, so I end this journey through the various phases of care with a quick word on planetary care, which we cannot afford to overlook, right? And this is work that Vishal is currently exploring for his dissertation research, and this is in collaboration also with Dr. Bani Nardi. Given the severity of the problems associated with climate change, many HCI scholars have begun to problematize the politics of growth in computing. And Alan Borning and colleagues know that the IT industry has linked itself strongly to this ethos of growth, with some particular manifestations being the constant need for novelty, the accompanying throwaway culture around consumer electronics, and the glorification of disruption for its own sake. Yet growth that requires ever more material resources cannot continue forever in a finite world. And Anne Light also points out that we as HCI researchers and designers are not designing individual interactive devices. We are contributing to a technologized environment where, regardless of our personal motivations, world-defining initiatives are being pursued for profit and or to see what greater technologization is possible. Neither goal is healthy for life on the planet. So to alter the economic growth paradigm, academics and activists have envisioned an alternate economy of post-growth that is not dependent on continual economic growth. Post-growth suggests centering the economy around progress, that is improvements in the quality of life, healthcare, education, and lifespan, instead of growth, that is instead of relying on or focusing on an increase in GDP. It proposes the reduction in resource consumption to stay within planetary limits, and this reduction could occur by shifting from producing more to redistributing what we already have. So post-growth supports values that cannot be reduced to material accumulation. These values might include solidarity, cooperation, care, sufficiency, frugality, conviviality, and autonomy, right? So how do we think about planetary care? How do we think about the care crisis that we're going through and how we're complicit in it? That's really the question that is at heart of this work. So in sum, there's a lot to care, right? I talked about care as the what and where, sometimes the who. I talked about care as orientation, the lens that we take to look at what's happening in the world, care as rigor, emphasizing the importance of method when we deal with questions of difference, but even generally. And finally, care as praxis in our deeper and more fundamental philosophical commitments to how we think about knowledge and research and practice. And there are multiple entry points to care, a lot that we can do to move towards futures that are caring and careful. And many of the areas that I mentioned today also represent significant challenges, right? That can seem daunting. Planetary care is certainly not an easy matter for existing systems to be grappling with. But thankfully, we're not alone. So we have many members of the CHIWORK community to begin with, to join forces with in our commitment to infusing care. Nupur Rabel, who is one of our speakers, and Papers shares talks about infusing care in the gig economy, for instance, and she has written, if we adopt a holistic approach to people beyond their userness, as actors creating sustainable lives within their complex, multifaceted realities, while remaining aligned with their aspirations, it might not transform platform work overnight into ideal and decent work, but would certainly infuse an ethic of care within next billion user tech design. Such an ethic of care would involve workers or users in small or big ways, rather than relying on behavioral change as a path to successful technology. And then we saw Naya Holton-Muller's work, who looks at the care that goes into doing data work, right? We heard from her earlier this year, and she asked who does the work of data, and talking about this data work wheel, which helps to make visible the data work that may otherwise go unnoticed when new digital systems and services are implemented in organizations or workflows are changed. Okay, so Bharat Raghavan, who was one of our speakers from last year, talked about planetary care, pointing out that global society has run up against the limits of the global ecosystem. And his work, his praxis is focused around questioning what are the ecological and social limits that we are likely to face in the future? And what is the role of computing in responding to them? And here with this excerpt, he asserts that all people and institutions play their role within the large system structure, right? So it's not industry that's the cause of all problems, nor the government, nor the environmentalists, but really all people and institutions play their role within the large system structure. This is from Donella Meadows. And finally, there was a chat in which we reported back from the workshop on the future of care work at CSEW last year, where everyone shared their own perspectives on these questions. So how is care work valued or devalued, visibilized or invisibilized, or coerced under capitalism, and to what end? What narratives drive the push for technology in care work, and whom does it benefit? Who controls narratives of the future of work, and what insights as a focus on care work open up? And how can we as researchers advocate for and with care and caregivers? Right, and all of this is just within this baby community. So there's also many more collectives out there that have been incredibly supportive of this kind of work, or are in solidarity with us, even when we're not actively collaborating. And here, for example, is a picture of those in the care and well-being collective that we formed at the start of the pandemic. And we didn't end up meeting a whole lot, but these scholars, their colleagues, and their colleagues' colleagues have enriched this growing landscape around care and well-being in HCI in no small ways. So I want to leave you with just an invitation to think about, maybe to discuss here or at other points in the conference or in the future, how you engage with care in your work, right? How does care show up for you? Whether it's a focus of your research, whether it could be an orientation, whether it shows up in your method as rigor, or whether it's a part of your praxis. We'd like to build on these conversations together. So if you've been thinking about them, we hope we can join you. If not, we invite you to join us.